The funeral of your supportive husband is about to start. You should act as the chief mourner to repay the kindness he showed you during his life. 5 years after divorcing, I received an unexpected call from my former mother-in-law, whom I hadn't been in contact with at all. Normally, a mother wouldn't invite her son's ex-wife to his funeral. I thought she was inviting me because she was in need of money. But something didn't add up. My ex-husband had passed away a year ago, and his funeral should have already taken place. I remember giving several $100s to someone who claimed to be collecting for organizing the funeral on behalf of my mother-in-law. Are you talking about a funeral, not the first anniversary of his death? What? The funeral is about to begin. Who in their right mind would hold a first anniversary now? If you're making up excuses to not be the chief mourner, at least make it believable. Something was seriously off in our conversation. What could this mean? I told her the name of the person who had collected the money, which left her speechless. She said there was more to discuss, so I hurried to the designated funeral home. There, a massive argument was unfolding between my former mother-in-law and another person. As I learned the details of the dispute, another individual became furiously angry. It was leading to a devastating outcome for my mother-in-law and the other person involved. I had married a man I met through a mutual friend when I was 30. Although we didn't have a lovey-dovey newlywed life since I got pregnant 2 months into the marriage, my in-laws were thrilled about their grandchild's upcoming birth. My relationship with them was good and my marriage was happy. However, about 3 months into the pregnancy, my husband's behavior became distant. He seemed uninterested in anything I said and often didn't touch the meals I prepared. The baby was growing well, and with only a week left until the due date, my husband became even more distant. Even when I tried to talk to him about my childbirth, he was too busy with work to even listen to my story. The night before I was admitted to the hospital, he said he wouldn't come home as he was staying out. I ended up taking a taxi to the hospital alone. As my husband had already refused to be present for the birth, citing work commitments, I was grateful for his kindness and agreed to be driven home by my father-in-law, who had been puzzled by my husband's lack of visits. On the day I was discharged from the hospital, I thought I'd be handling the paperwork alone, just like when I was admitted. However, my father-in-law insisted on at least driving me home. I was grateful for his kindness and agreed to be driven home. I had suspected that he might use this as an excuse to complain about my husband, so I asked him if he wanted to stop by our house. After some hesitation, he decided it would be best for family matters to remain private and dropped me off without coming in. I sensed someone inside the house and was sure it was my husband. I wondered why he wasn't at work on a weekday afternoon, but I decided to prioritize reuniting with my son over confronting him about not visiting me or his absence from work. I entered the house cheerfully, saying, "I'm home," with a bit of extra enthusiasm. My husband appeared from the back and suddenly presented me with something. "I've decided to marry my mistress, so sign these divorce papers quickly." How long does it take to get discharged anyway? He had been waiting for me to return so he could divorce me as soon as possible. He was visibly irritated and insisted that I had no right to refuse. He even said he never wanted our child and threatened to harm our son if I didn't comply. I couldn't agree to a divorce without understanding why. Especially not for the sole reason of him wanting to marry his mistress. Suddenly a divorce? We just had a baby, why? I remembered how my husband's behavior had been strange ever since I got pregnant. I never expected him to announce a divorce, especially not with an existing mistress. "It's your fault for not taking care of me, your husband. You should have prioritized me over an unborn child. You're to blame." During my pregnancy, I often felt unwell, especially with severe morning sickness. I had explained to him that some women experience these symptoms during pregnancy, and I was one of them. Especially in my case, I was told that I had a tendency to exhibit these symptoms more strongly. I wasn't neglecting him on purpose, and I did care for him even when I wasn't feeling well. But now, to find out he had been cheating and supporting a mistress, I was furious, but the anger was so overwhelming that I was almost speechless. To think he was having an affair supporting a mistress? Seriously, what's that about? So all those times he said he was busy with work or stayed out were just excuses for his time with his mistress. Of course I'm angry at my husband. But when anger becomes too overwhelming, it can actually lead to a state of disbelief and leave one speechless. It seemed pointless to argue with such a selfish man. A man who acts like a child, only thinking about himself and making such selfish demands. I'm better off without him. I quickly signed the divorce papers he thrust at me and returned them to him. However, I felt obligated to inform my kind-in-laws, especially since I had just been with my father-in-law. When I contacted my in-laws, my mother-in-law answered that my father-in-law hadn't returned home yet. Despite her previous kindness, she blamed me for the divorce, claiming it was my fault. If you had properly fulfilled your role as a wife, there wouldn't have been any problems. You must have refused relations using pregnancy as an excuse, right? Didn't you think about how much it hurts to be rejected by your own wife? She called me a failure of a woman for not satisfying a man, and agreed with the decision to divorce. She even said I shouldn't expect any property division because I was solely to blame. I was told not to expect any division of property since I was supposedly all to blame, but I was the victim here. I declared to my mother-in-law that even if there was no property division, I would still demand alimony. Later on, my father-in-law intervened regarding the property division, ensuring I received the rightful amount. I also had to meet my husband's mistress just once. She looked down on me, seeing me as the woman who was discarded and ousted from the position of the legitimate wife. In my heart, I thought she would eventually be cheated on and discarded herself. What goes around comes around. I believe she would eventually be cheated on and discarded herself. After dropping me off, my father-in-law had stopped somewhere else before going home. If he hadn't, he could have prevented my mother-in-law's harsh words and sternly reprimanded my husband. He apologized for not being able to help more and showed his sincerity. And he promised to ensure I received the money owed to me. As a result, my husband contacted me to pay the full amount of alimony and child support. However, he stipulated that once I received the money, I should never contact him again. I had no intention of wasting my time on such a despicable man as long as I received what I was owed. After a while, true to his word, he transferred the full amount of alimony and child support. He never showed any concern for our son beyond the child support. I could tell he had no interest in the child I bore. I decided to move back to my parents' house with my son. Upon learning the reason for the divorce, my parents were furious, but they refrained from confronting my husband due to the genuine effort my father-in-law had shown. 3 months later, I heard through the grapevine that my ex-husband had remarried his mistress. I had met him through an acquaintance, so I could have found out more, but I never inquired. My son is growing up healthy and strong with the help of my parents. That's all that mattered to me, everything else was secondary. This was until an unexpected person appeared before me. 4 years later, it was a truly sudden event. I was living happily with my parents and my son. My father was still working, but spent his weekends playing with my son, which was a great help to me. As my son turned 4, keeping up with his endless energy became a challenge. When I was out of breath, my father would take over and vice versa. Seeing us exhausted made my son laugh. Feeling him grow up healthy was my greatest joy. One day, while my parents took my son out, I was alone at home. It was the day I gratefully accepted my mother's advice that everyone needs a break now and then. While I was relaxing, taking a break, the mistress of my ex-husband suddenly showed up unexpectedly. I decided to record our conversation on my phone while cautiously speaking to her. At first, I intended to ignore her, but the mistress kept shouting that she knew I was home, so I reluctantly responded. However, the last time I met my ex-husband's mistress was when I went to demand alimony during our divorce. It had been 4 years since then, and we hadn't exchanged a single message. Why was she suddenly at my parents' house? I told her I wouldn't listen to whatever she had to say until I understood why she was there. Surprisingly, she confessed that she got my address from my former mother-in-law. I haven't been in touch with that mother-in-law either, so what do you want now? Your ex-husband passed away. I thought I should let you know as his former wife. I don't want to be blamed later for not providing enough child support. My ex-husband died? Well, it's not surprising when anyone dies. But why did she come all the way to my parents' house to tell me something that could have been done over the phone? I became suspicious of the mistress's intentions. So he's gone. When did he die? What was the cause? Does it matter when or why? He's dead, isn't that enough? Anyway, I came to visit you, so hurry up and give me a suitable amount. Excuse me? Why should I support organizing a funeral for my ex-husband? I hesitated to give her anything since she couldn't provide details about his death. However, her story about his cause of death kept changing between a seizure, natural causes, and some complicated illness. I don't have the death certificate with me, so I can't say for sure. It was some complicated disease that you don't hear about often. Is it possible to have a natural death from such a serious illness? I persistently asked when exactly this had happened. 4 years ago, my ex-husband was as healthy as could be. Some diseases can strike suddenly, so it's hard to say for sure, but the more I questioned my ex-husband's mistress, the more her story kept changing. Stop pestering me. Just give me money. If I don't bring it back, I'll have to face my mother-in-law's wrath. The mistress kept insisting on money and mentioned facing punishment from her mother-in-law if she returned empty-handed. For a moment, I thought the mother-in-law might actually do something like that, but I still felt reluctant to just give money. Sorry, but the situation isn't clear, and besides, I haven't had any contact with my ex since our divorce, which was caused by your affair with him. Don't you think I'm not obligated to support his funeral? Could you do it if you were in my shoes? I tried to explain my stance without getting emotional or upsetting her. But the mistress said she would stay until I gave her money. I checked the time, and it was almost time for my parents and son to return home. The thought of them meeting her made me shudder. I feared what she might do to my son. She said she just wanted the money. I pulled out about $500 from my wallet and handed it to her. I opened the door slightly to hand over the money, and she grabbed it and left. As she walked away, I told her I would call the police if she came here again. She didn't nod, but I sensed a slight stiffness in her body. About 10 minutes later, my parents and son returned home. I was relieved they hadn't run into her. Since then, I tried not to think too much about this incident. But a year later, an unexpected twist awaited me. I often receive calls from unknown numbers due to my job. So unless I am unable to answer, I always respond to calls from unknown numbers. Thinking it was just one of those calls, I answered the phone despite not recognizing the number. A familiar voice said, "Your ex-husband's funeral is starting. You need to be the chief mourner. Come right now, do you understand?" She sounded quite frantic. I thought it might be my mother-in-law calling, but when she mentioned my ex-husband, I was sure. Why a funeral? Why was I supposed to be the chief mourner? Hadn't my ex-husband died last year? I vividly remembered the incident from a year ago that I had tried to forget. I had been informed of my ex-husband's death by his mistress, who claimed she was there to collect money on behalf of my mother-in-law. I explained to my mother-in-law that I had given her the money. However, she just saw my explanation as an excuse to avoid being the chief mourner and started yelling at me, accusing me of making up stories. I was sure that nothing I said would convince her otherwise. So I decided to let her listen to the recording of my conversation with the mistress from that time. Initially, my mother-in-law kept yelling at me to hurry up and stop avoiding the issue. But as the recorded conversation played, she gradually became silent. "Just come to the funeral immediately, no matter what," she finally said, determined to make me attend the funeral. She even threatened to come and get me if I didn't show up. Not wanting my parents and son to meet the mistress or my mother-in-law, I decided to head to the funeral home. As I got ready to leave, leaving my son with my parents, the situation seemed increasingly strange. What was really going on? Curious about the truth, I hurried to the funeral home my former mother-in-law had mentioned. When I arrived, I found her and the mistress arguing loudly outside the venue, their voices carrying to the attendees waiting outside. The guests were whispering among themselves, confused by the commotion. I listened in on the argument before approaching my mother-in-law. "What are you doing? claiming your husband died and then demanding money from the ex-wife you dumped? Shut up. It's his fault for not earning enough, my mother-in-law replied. I thought he made good money, but I was deceived after taking on the role of the legitimate wife. Something didn't add up in their argument. An attendee, who had been listening to the whole fight, explained the situation to others. I turned my attention to him. Apparently, the mistress had accumulated a huge debt she couldn't repay, so she pretended her still-living ex-husband was dead to extort money from me. The money I gave ended up being used to pay off her debts. She must have been desperate to come to me, someone she'd rather avoid. My mother-in-law, who seemed genuinely unaware of this, was berating the mistress for being greedy. But it seemed she had had some suspicions about the mistress's love for money. I was against their marriage from the start, I said. I never imagined you'd squander money and rack up debts. My mother-in-law admitted that even her savings had been used by the mistress. However, the mistress had her own complaints. If I'm greedy, then your son is a disloyal womanizer, she said. I should tell everyone here. He died during an affair of all things. Regardless of how he died, this wasn't the time for such behavior. As I looked around in disbelief, my father-in-law, who had been standing in front of my ex-husband's casket, intervened to stop the low-level brawl between his wife and the mistress. I hesitated on what to say to him, but couldn't just stand by and watch. I approached and offered my condolences, my words trailing off at the end. Part of the reason I spoke up was that he looked so pitiful. When I spoke, he was genuinely surprised. And that made sense. After all, I had been treated terribly by his son. It's no wonder he was so shocked, seeing me at the funeral, without having received any prior communication. I explained everything to him. From the mistress showing up at my parents' house a year ago, to the call from my mother-in-law earlier that day. Hearing this, my father-in-law, who had been trying to mediate the fight calmly, became visibly angry. Enough already, he exclaimed. How much more trouble do you plan to cause her? Then the mistress and mother-in-law stopped their fight and turned on me, blaming me for everything. This is all your fault, they said. You're the reason everything's a mess. As the mistress reached out to grab my shoulder, my father-in-law stepped in to protect me. You two are the ones causing trouble. I just thought, since this woman refused to be the chief mourner, this ex-wife could do it. You were the one who was in trouble when she refused. I understood that being suddenly refused as a chief mourner could be problematic, but my mother-in-law could have just done it herself. Her irrational and selfish behavior left my father-in-law cold, and he told her that after the funeral, they would divorce. This word of divorce drastically changed my mother-in-law's demeanor. She suddenly turned soft, pleading with my father-in-law to reconsider. However, his mind seemed firmly made up, leaving my mother-in-law with nothing but to hang her head in defeat. It appeared my mother-in-law had always been rather unreasonable. She had never worked outside the home, which might have contributed to her behavior. Despite overlooking some of her antics, my father-in-law had tried to correct her worst behaviors. But it seemed his efforts were in vain. Right after witnessing this, I left the funeral home. Later, my father-in-law contacted me, wanting to repay the money swindled by the mistress. I could have just accepted the bank transfer, but since he had always been kind to me, I decided it would be good to meet him one last time. He told me that after I left, the whole story unfolded before all the attendees. Everything from my ex-husband's secret affairs to the truth about his death became public, turning the funeral into chaos. The atmosphere was far from one of mourning. It was uncomfortably tense. Most of the funeral attendees were people my father-in-law knew, and the family's messy affairs quickly spread throughout the community. Fortunately, my father-in-law was well-liked, and no one spoke ill of him. The center of the controversy was the unreasonable mother-in-law, the money-hungry, debt-ridden mistress, and my irresponsible ex-husband. There was a lot of sympathy for my father-in-law even amidst the turmoil. The mistress continued to squat in the family home, but my father-in-law eventually had to kick her out. She needed to work to pay off her debts and survive, but her self-inflicted reputation made it hard for her to find a job. It was a case of getting what she deserved. I thought it had nothing to do with me, until one day she turned up for a job interview at my workplace. When I returned to my parents' home and was looking for a job, I initially wanted something close by, but finding the right job proved challenging. Heeding my parents' advice, I broadened my search area and eventually found employment. That's why I now work a bit far from my parents' and former in-laws' place. The place is in a region where I didn't expect to encounter acquaintances. However, I suspected that the mistress may have ended up here looking for a job in a different area due to her questionable reputation. I work at a regional bank. Initially, I was employed at a major bank but resigned when I got married. When I was looking to re-enter the workforce, I didn't want to return to banking at first. Dealing with unresolved issues until late hours and having a young son to think about, I didn't want to burden my parents, who were helping me. My priority was to focus on my son until he finished elementary school. However, finding a job as a woman re-entering the workforce was challenging, so I eventually followed my parents' advice to focus on banking, where I had previous experience. Bank interviews are quite rigorous, understandably, given that it involves handling customers' money. By chance, I knew that my immediate boss and the person in charge of interviews were former colleagues. I discreetly informed my boss about the mistress's history of scamming for money and her reckless borrowing. While it is not uncommon for bank employees to have loans, the mistress's debts were due to her personal indulgences and were beyond her repayment capacity. My boss took the scamming incident seriously, and this information was passed on to the interview coordinator. As a result, the mistress was disqualified from the interview just before it was about to take place. As she was leaving, she happened to cross paths with me. I was working at the time, so avoiding her was not an option. I thought she wouldn't cause a scene in front of customers, but I was wrong. As soon as she saw me, she came straight at me, yelling, "This is all your fault," and grabbed me by the collar. A nearby customer screamed, and a male colleague rushed over to separate us, while someone else called for security. The security guards quickly intervened and escorted the mistress out of the building. My boss asked if I wanted to file a police report, but I declined, believing I wouldn't have to deal with her again. While I felt safe at work thanks to the presence of security guards, I was concerned about being targeted during my commute. A few days after reassuring everyone that I was fine, I had a rude awakening. I received a call from the police at work. Apparently the mistress had told them where I worked. I was about to tell the police that I had nothing to do with her, but their explanation left me stunned. It seemed that the mistress and my mother-in-law had conspired to break into my parents' house to steal valuables. However, I had not received any call from my mother, who should have been the victim. Why did the police contact me directly, and why would the mistress tell the police where I worked? I asked the police for the address of the house the mistress and mother-in-law had broken into. It turned out to be the house where I used to live with my parents. My parents had moved us out immediately for our safety after the mistress tried to scam us a year ago. The old house, being well located, was quickly sold and someone else was now living there. Unaware of this, the mistress and mother-in-law had broken in, attempting to steal valuables. The current residents must have been quite shocked and immediately called the police, who caught them red-handed. However, the residents did not press charges since they were not the intended targets. Normally, even attempted crimes can result in criminal penalties. However, the victims did not file a police report, reasoning that they were not the intended targets of the crime. The police gave the mistress and mother-in-law a stern warning, but required someone to vouch for them before releasing them. That's why they named me as their guarantor and informed the police of my workplace, despite not knowing my current address. I was astounded by their audacity in asking me, of all people, to vouch for them. They really had the nerve. Having divorced, I had no obligation to my former mother-in-law, and the mistress was someone I despised, not even a family member. I made this clear to the police and ended the call. The thought of what might have happened if my parents hadn't moved chilled me. I checked the time. My son would be returning from kindergarten soon and my mother would be at home with him. Still shaking, my boss, noticing my distress, suggested I leave early to rest. The mistress and my mother-in-law, after causing so much chaos, each followed their own deserved paths. Starting with my mother-in-law, after my father-in-law left the family home and its land to her, she was left to live there alone. For someone so unreasonable, she was strangely concerned about her public image. With rumors of my ex-husband's infidelity and her attempted theft spreading, she became a recluse. Convinced that everyone was against her and speaking ill of her, she shut herself away from the world. Her family had lived in that area for generations, so they had long-standing relationships with the neighbors. However, the family home remained closed off, with overgrown gardens and no response to the doorbell. Concerned residents eventually reported to the authorities, who conducted a welfare check. They found my mother-in-law emaciated, almost skeletal, and muttering incoherently, making it clear she couldn't continue living there alone. She was then placed in a facility, but her current status is unknown. The mistress, on the other hand, struggled with job hunting in the local area, especially after her police incident became known. She moved to a new place in search of a fresh start, but with depleted funds and increasing debts, she borrowed from dangerous lenders and eventually disappeared. Rumors say even those shady figures are looking for her. Haha. If they can't find her, she may have met a grim end. My mother-in-law, being an only daughter, inherited the family estate, but her naivety led them to welcome my well-grounded father-in-law. Despite his character, he could not change my mother-in-law. Now he has returned to his birthplace to live the life he may have chosen if he had not married into the family. He still cares deeply for his son, so he occasionally updates me on his well-being. I only receive a yearly response to my letters, but it is clear from his messages that he is enjoying a fulfilling second chapter of his life. This whole ordeal has been a burden to my parents, and I have declared that I will work hard to ensure their comfortable retirement. They have told me not to worry about them, and have encouraged me to remarry if I find the right person. I do feel guilty about my son growing up without a father's love, but the future is unpredictable. I have chosen not to see this experience as a stain on my life, but as a necessary one. I am committed to living in the present and embracing the infinite possibilities of the future. I want to teach my son that life is full of choices and not to be limited by predetermined paths. I have vowed to engage more with my son and strive for even greater happiness as a family of 4.